Well, welcome back to SideQuest VIII, episode 16, I believe, here with Wes Schantz. And from my own new location and finding myself on my own side quest, here from Regal University of Oxford and Campion Hall amidst the Jesuits, I find myself across the Atlantic Ocean and now farther than ever from Wes, but with a better than ever T1 internet connection. Wes, it is good to see you. 8 hours behind me right now,
Yeah.
though so far ahead of me in your thinking, I no doubt.
Um, it's a little bit of time compression, isn't it, that we're engaged in here? And yeah, it's good to hear that in Oxford, in the ancient halls, they have adopted the modern magic of Wi-Fi and good internet, and we can still talk. So, how's your conference going? You were just telling me a little bit about it, but I mean, I gotta know. Inquiring minds want to know.
It's gone very well. So, just to give a little background to our listeners on what it is I'm up to, I am a graduate fellow right now at LSU and will finish writing my dissertation on Dante and his Islamo-Judaic rationalist influences, which is a very cosmopolitan project, and that's something I was presenting on to medieval philosophers and some theologians here in Oxford, while also working on very important interreligious dialogue between the Abrahamic faiths, which is something that I do as a medievalist, and I've developed skills in Greek, Latin, all the Romance languages except for Portuguese and Arabic, and we'll soon be working on Hebrew too, because what is life about without many side quests? Perhaps one can do no better than to finish many side quests, or at least go on many side quests in one's life. But in 8 or 9 days, perhaps more excitingly to the crowd that listens to our podcast, but perhaps not, there is the Rituals of Play conference that I will be, as it turns out, going to in person because I have accepted from Campion Hall a short-term fellowship for around 10 days, which will allow me to stay here in King Arthur's own island, Beowulf's own island, Tolkien's own island. I mean, I was asked today whether I was going to Evensong, which was an event I did not know the meaning of. And I heard beautiful choirs singing psalms outside of my window. And to me, as an American in the UK, that just, it was very Harry Potter, C.S. Lewis, the sort of magic that that fantasy has evoked. And so I'm very much looking forward to going to this next conference, this time in Manchester,
Yeah.
rather than in Oxford, and also presenting, unfortunately not in physical person, alongside Wes, but through the magic of time compression, he will come through in the form that our listeners know best. So hopefully we can record that so that we can that can be posted somewhere for our listeners too, so they can hear your more academic work. But that was something that we were going to talk about today. The nature of my current side quest. Though, like the Mino, we should probably define what justice is before we talk about just things. And so maybe we need to talk about the nature of side quests. And this is an appropriate moment because as I've been on this side quest, diverging from the main quest, I have not made any progress in that, which is to say, I have not done my homework and played Final Fantasy VIII during my travels to Oxford so far, which I imagine that the listeners appreciate. But then we were also thinking we might talk a little bit about what we're going to present on at this conference. And if our listeners want to give us some feedback, please do. But
Cool.
I hope that they appreciate that these are, these discussions are our first pass approximations, as it were, to quote an old friend of ours, and that we do have a more serious, more disciplined way of engaging with our ideas and do also present in front of, our fellow experts who are more than willing, I think, to help us with our work, but also to criticize the weaknesses in our work. So I'm very happy to have this public facing um, branch of our work that we share, but we do live a very serious life in our regular life too, uh, where we are subject to scrutiny by our peers.
Well, I think that's more in your case than mine. To be honest, I have not presented at a conference that's this academic in a long time, not since St. John's, when there was like a I don't know what it was, something about the humanities in
Down in
the,
DC with
you know,
Patrick
East
Bateman
Coast.
and Jeff Black and all of them.
Yeah. No, I can't remember a time that I've had to do something like this. So I've done things online for Signum though, and that's kind of a similar public facing yet academic space that I'm pretty comfortable in. And so that's how I'm treating this so as not to get too nervous about it. But in your case, since you're, doing a PhD and
In the
you're
biz.
hobnobbing with the even singers and all this, yeah, you better cite your sources and all. I mean, if you have some good papers, send them my way because that's the main thing I'm concerned about is that I don't know quite what to cite other than Huizinga, right? And people writing about him. Now he's pretty passé, I think, in game studies, at least the branches of it that I'm familiar with. Um, and so.
Great
Uh,
starting point, though.
I mean, he's exceptionally interesting as a writer, as a person. Uh, I did a dive on him when I was first starting the site and read a lot of his work. So he writes about medieval things, he writes about Dutch things, he writes about American things. He's just a wide-ranging, really brilliant um, writer. And he has this famous quote about the magic circle that gets cited ad nauseum throughout game studies. And so nobody, um, well, we never tire of recurring to those kind of original sources, do we? So that's definitely where I kind of took my point of departure for the idea I had for the conference, thinking about the magic circle as a summoning circle, right? In the original sense of like this is a circle for doing magic. What does that mean? What are we summoning? What are we finding? What are we expecting to find? What actually appears when we do our spells in the summoning circle? That is the video game. And I'm writing about Final Fantasy VII. So yeah, so that's kind of the conceit that I'm working off of as a way in, as a pseudo academic approach to basically just getting an excuse to talk about Final Fantasy VII a whole bunch with a bunch of smart people, for like a day. I can't attend most of the talks. It's spread over like 2 or 3 days, right? And I can't do the in-person activities, unfortunately, but I'll at least be there for my panel, and it should be super cool. Yeah.
I look forward to seeing your work there. And in the pre-show, it's always funny pulling back the veil a little bit, the pre-show. Um, what all these things that is the hat from which we pull our various rabbits. You mentioned that you had been reviewing our previous podcasts on Final Fantasy
Yes.
VII, I where we for some number of them had Mr. Vincent Reese helping us along.
Mhm.
And but yeah, so I was really interested in which of those you were listening to and what you thought of them. Were they still very helpful? Are they interesting? Are those ideas
Yeah.
that yeah, that you still think are worth developing?
Absolutely. So as I was trying to refamiliarize with the game, primarily just like what happens in the story, I thought it would also be a good idea to listen to what I have on record and you have on record saying about this game. So it's actually the episode after Vincent uh, disappeared from our party, and that's where we are. I think it's the first time that we're outside Midgar. So
Hmm.
we spent a lot of episodes dealing with the Midgar material. Uh, and then once we're outside Midgar, that's where we do the calm flashback. And then we see Sephiroth and we see the Shinra mansion for the first time. And
Hmm.
that's in this theme of like rituals of play, I was going to focus on the idea of a ritual space, right? So the magic circle, and in this
Hmm.
case, the mansion itself is the primary game space that I'm going to talk about. I'm going to kind of contrast it with the game
Hmm.
space of the world map and the game space of Midgar behind that, and
Hmm.
also talk about like battle space and dialogue space as like menu space if you want to think of it that way. So
What
that's kind
about
of the
the
approach I'm taking.
saucer as a space? Sorry, just a
Yeah. Well, so
game.
um,
Sorry.
this is where the esoteric, the occult comes in because in
Hmm.
the course of that flashback, um, you're seeing that there is something Cloud is hiding from himself and hiding from the others as he's this kind of, um, you know, unreliable narrator. Um, there is, of course, also stuff going on that is pointing at lacunae, right? Like gaps. So you get this item in Calm, which is a gun. And it's great because you have a character who can equip guns. no, this gun is not to be attached to an arm for Barrett, but is actually a handgun, like one you hold in your hand. And you
Mhm.
have no characters in your party who can hold such a gun, weirdly enough. Um, and that's a weapon for Vincent, the in-game character, Vincent, who we find later. So then I jumped ahead like 10 episodes or something to where we arrive at Nibble Mountains and Nibelheim Village, and you get to actually explore the mansion a little bit more. And you do this side quest. So there's that idea again, which we have yet to define, where you get to open the safe and get this key that opens this door. That then you have to go through certain dialogue choices with this guy in a coffin for him to come out and join your party. So that's like the nested side quests idea is implicit here too, right? So there's the overarching storyline, pursue Sephiroth, right? There's the story within that of what is up with Cloud's memory and his relationship to these other characters. There's the story within that of, okay, about his hometown though, what's up with this building and its basement and the safe and the locked door and the coffin and the person in the coffin. So there's this kind of Russian doll effect. And of course, this guy in the coffin has a backstory of his own, which helps us understand Sephiroth. So it comes full circle. It's pretty wonderful that way. So I'm wary of getting like too in the weeds with everything and like trying to explain the whole game. So I'm gonna try to not do that. But I'm at the stage where I'm trying to like start to pare down. So like what images from the game do I want to show as I'm talking through this line of inquiry about like hiding secrets in games, using game
Mhm.
space to uh, engage the player and their emotions and their intellect. I don't really have a thesis. I mean, I never do, St. John's. But but I am interested in just kind of thinking through, contemplating um, essentially like how games can be used for education. That's like always my idea that I'm sort of circling around. And I feel like this is more theoretical. I'm trying to move towards a more practical, uh, you know, interventions in my own teaching and stuff. This is not that. I'm not at that stage yet. So I'm just kind of having fun with this. So that's where I'm at.
I think it's a good first step, and you can develop or find the theoretical apparatus you want to use at some point, and then, develop it as a pedagogical tool, and maybe even present it either prior to utilizing it or after and sharing your results.
Mhm.
But what you say is very interesting, and so just to connect that to the notion of the nature of side quests, as as you know, and perhaps the listeners also know just from hearing me, and certainly my students do, I seem to occupy a certain Japanese emotion, which is, I'm forgetting the term for it exactly, I'll look it up, but where one is sort of young but recognizes the temporality of one's life and the temporariness of one's life, and that creates a certain world weariness and sadness. And so I have sort of an existential angst perpetually to myself, realizing that all that I have will disappear. And it makes me wonder about the value in self-created value of things. And I tend to be in the camp that like existentialists thinks that life is often, particularly in this day and age, one has to sort of create one's own path and give value to the things one wants to do. And yes, the word is the term is mono no aware. And that's certainly what it is. Um, but so that means that if one sort of like the THC ingester wants to say, well, like an Epicurean,
Mhm.
there may be no afterlife, and so in this Aldous Huxley also way, why not just have a little pleasant life and not take things too seriously. That would seem to be one way to deal with the problem of mono no aware, or
Mhm.
living in a world in which one has to create one's own value, and there might not be value existing outside one's own decisions. I'm not taking that hard line with that, by the way, just more as a subjective experience of things.
Mhm.
Um, but I think the other way of dealing with that is to go on a side quest, but not just to go on a side quest, but to go into nested side quests. Why play a game at a high level, Wes? Like why not just play a little bit of chess, a little bit of checkers, and a little bit of this game and that? Why get really good at a game? I wonder, well, I'm going to make a bunch of loose points together. I wonder if a developing skill is like going on many, many side quests, um, just with a large focus. But I wonder if one way of dealing with the problem of existential angst or a nihilism or a potential meaninglessness in one's life in a secular age is to go into nested side quests. And so when I say that, do I mean just busy oneself with lots of things to do? No, because when you were describing going to the Shinra mansion and going through the safe, and you omitted that terrible boss that you have to fight
Oh
that's
yeah,
really
the
awful.
lost number. I've got a whole section on the lost number. Don't worry.
And so, but you weren't just filling time with that
Hmm.
description. You were drawing me along through an unveiling mystery. And so living life as an act of discovery through getting deeper and deeper into some sort of mystery that external to the path itself might not seem to have value. Like, why are you even playing the video game? Somebody might ask, and you're like, whatever, you don't understand anything. And like, you have to like video games, but then the experience of it is so satisfying that I don't even care to defend it to you, but that and perhaps this is an argument for the philosophical life too, right? um, that what is the objective value of going on this side quest in the game? There is some, and you learn more about the game, but does it help you advance? Maybe if Vincent is your best character, but it's really not, and it doesn't really matter in Final Fantasy VII. And I actually found him very late with my typical sloppy game playing. Um, but when I first played Final Fantasy VII, but I think you reminded me to get him very early when we played together. Um, and I'm glad that you're revisiting that, and I'm glad that it's helpful too, because it's helpful to you, then that means it's pretty helpful. Um, but I, but what is the value of going on that side quest outside of the game at all, and to you as a person? Well, I think it shows you what the subjective value, at least, is of engaging and engaging deeply with something and watching it unfold and discovering what the experience is of pursuing something that may even be difficult to attain because that hidden, that lost number boss, really, I remember him wiping me out several times. He's one of those really
Yeah.
hard bosses like Materia Keeper that Final Fantasy VII is renowned, one of those unfairly difficult bosses that comes out of nowhere, seemingly. But luckily, I think the strategy guide said, and I'd like to know how you dealt with it. But the side quest, I think, is billed as sort of a useless leisure activity that in that way reflects philosophy, insofar as philosophy is engaged in at leisure. But I
Mhm.
think it also does something that philosophy does too, which is it produces meaning and it uncovers meaning. And there may be those may be one and the same. And so even though it seems like something of little value at first, almost alchemical language, right? Like Jung would like that thing of little value, or Christian language even. Um, but in going down it, one discovers, that this isn't just some sand, it's a desert or something much deeper, sort of like what Squall is uncovering right now, and also Cloud, that the depths are that he didn't even get the magnitude of the depths correct, and that itself is expanding of one's conception of one's world and oneself even. And so what you say is really interesting about going full circle, because one in some ways produces a complete life in doing that sort of thing and bounding oneself to a single activity. One can discover, I think, something more universal than the particular activity. And besides, the material you're working with and the way you describe it being, I think, intrinsically interesting. I think it also hints at the nature of a good life and the nature of our project, and the response that I think we give to both of our wives when they ask why we do this. Though
Uh,
for clear professional reasons too, namely coming up in about 10 days.
yeah, yeah, it is intrinsically interesting, and it is very much tied into a larger project of understanding the mythic, uh, sort of mythic language, mythic themes and archetypes, if you want, like that underlie a lot of our culture today, and our kind of problem of a lack of meaning that is everywhere apparent. Um, I mean, I think that playing games is one of the least bad options for how to spend your time,
I
if
agree.
I was
I
forced to
agree
say.
entirely.
Um, but again, it's hard to convince someone of that, just sort of without actually having them try it at some point. And so I think it's cool that as part of the conference, right, they're going to have
A
some
game
sort of
thing.
experiential
Yeah.
components going on, and that seems really interesting too. Yeah, so it's cool you get to experience those.
Well, that's something for all the things we do on Zoom, it is a pale substitute for meeting in person. It is better
Mhm.
than nothing, but it is not better than the thing itself. And so I want to, though, as much as I value the virtual world, I want to see these people IRL and perhaps dine with them and maybe compete with them and or play cooperatively with them in video
Mhm.
games and just see what they're all about and report back to you, my friend, and to our few viewers. But we never know how many people will be watching this in the future.
True.
And so possibly us, most importantly, to our
Yeah.
own research, So it's good that we do good work, and that's something I one of the senior scholars here was saying to me. He was like, I read these articles of mine sometimes from the past, and I've forgotten what I said, and I think to myself, oh, this guy kind of knew what he was talking about. So hopefully you're experiencing that with the Final Fantasy VII, and please let me know if I ever said anything insightful, because of course solipsistically, narcissistically, that's also what I'm interested in. Or just anything we got really interested in, or whether we've ourselves started to come full circle or to at least revisit like a celestial sphere topics that we were touching on in Final Fantasy VII.
Oh, definitely. Yeah, there's a lot of overlap really between themes that are coming up in Final Fantasy VII and Final Fantasy VIII, especially since we're in very much the same kind of territory with what we're talking about these days, um, on the side quests and a thing. Um, so yeah, but so you're gonna write about slash talk about Final Fantasy VIII at the conference, right? So you've got a little bit of catching up to do yourself because we're only like a third of the way through the game, maybe. I don't know, give or take.
Yeah, so this is going to be more of a preliminary stage paper that I'm going to present to them, though it needs to get developed pretty quickly, and then hopefully it also needs to get developed for Routledge, and but I haven't heard back from them yet, so I'm just crossing my fingers. But my original abstract involves me exploring how the nature of Squall's consciousness is developed by it expands in direct proportion to his understanding of the nature of the world around him. And so,
Hmm.
as his notion of how large and powerful the world is expands, so does his consciousness. And it is literally his understanding and knowledge of the world, which is also mitigated by direct experience and experiences that very few of us would ever have that create and have a very expansive consciousness. And that this book illustrates in somewhat short form, in its own time compressed way, the expansion from a very childish attitude to to the attitude that a hero of light, that archetypal would have to wield. For so like a very sort of selfish, closed off perspective to, somebody willing to risk their life to save the world and being successful. Um, and not just the world, but all of reality to some extent, to save it from a vicious cycle that it finds itself in. And I hope that you engage with the differences or similarities between the vicious cycle that Ultimatia promises and the true magic circle, and
Hmm.
how those circles, how one is maybe an evil circle and one a good, or maybe that is her own twisted sort of rationalist political project, right? She can destroy all suffering if she can trap us all in time or something like that, something like a Soviet project, as it were. But no, so that's what I started with, Wes. But I also have gotten excited as I've read just a little bit of secondary literature now, and I'm really quickly trying to familiarize myself with this subdiscipline of my discipline because there are many medievalists and Renaissance scholars who are in this space based on the work of Huizinga, I would imagine. As he too, as a medievalist, had a major effect with on the study of play and the nature of play and the importance of play. And it's good that we have these scholars. I think a lot of people hear medievalists and they think about like jesters and courts too. And I don't really deal with that sort of aspect of the Middle Ages most of the time, more the bloody and literary parts. But this is this yeah. So, but this is also part of it, and thus very important. What I've also started getting excited about is the question of genre and
Hmm.
the use of the word epic. And so I work on epic literature. I am a Dantista and I've taught Homer for over 10 years as well as Virgil. So I'm very, very well versed in the epic tradition as well as Milton, and I arguably figures like Cervantes who have an epic taste to them. But in any case, there are thinkers now who want to take epic away from just poetry as a term, but to ascribe it also to genres like video games.
Hmm.
The same thinker, I believe, is also trying to make the case that one can use the word more in a different way and more descriptively to describe moments in games that are of outstanding significance, which I think is a descriptive use of the term now. People say epic. That was an epic moment. Um, and and so to bring the word epic over as a term that can be used in the genre of video games, especially as they become more artistic, like games like Clair Obscura, um, and uh, and which is well, we still need to talk about playing at some
Yeah.
point. But also the descriptive use of the term, and so I really like that because this makes it so that one can start integrating authors who have considered epic, particularly classical epic and medieval epic, like authors that I've spent a lot of time ingesting myself, and use their terminology and use the research that they've already built in order to consider video games, which is, I think, what we were starting to do in Final Fantasy VII.
Mhm.
And so there's a lot of serious work that's already been done in a slightly different discipline, but by people who were also part of the current discipline that studies video games in so far as they're medievalists and Renaissance studies people, and but also recognizing in a non-stodgy way the new uses of these terms and the value that it can be derived from studying them. Because I think that was our one of my big questions for Final Fantasy VII is it of epic quality?
Yeah.
And I
Right.
think in our last conversation, I weighed against that. But I think with if these pieces I'm reading give me new interpretive tools for understanding the genre correctly, and I may have been making a genre mistake.
Hmm.
And so that is definitely something I want to include. But I am going to, in some ways, echoing Professor Kozlowski, that we have many differences in how, not many differences, but we have differences in how we see certain things and also the valence of certain things, within the game, in particular the romance element. But something that's going to happen soon is the romance element is going to get a little heavier.
Hmm.
And so something I also wish to include in my analysis is even if we're expanding the use of epic, and by the generic standards, this game would seem to meet those criteria. It will also have to compete with perhaps a redefinition or new definition of what a romance is.
Hmm.
And in particular, a chivalric romance, like those criticized by Don Quixote. So differently from Professor Kozlowski, I would not call this game a romance. I would call it a chivalric romance. And very clearly a chivalric romance because of the notion of knights and queens and magic. And so I think I thank him for that initial contribution, but I do think it is more like that which Don Quixote um criticized, more like an Orlando Furioso in that respect. But
To throw another, sorry to interrupt, but to throw another genre at you, we've been talking about the Bildungsroman, right? And Roman there is rooted in romance. It means novel, sort of, kind of. But so, I mean, there's something there, right? There's some
you're right.
Bildungs to go with the
Yes,
romance, the chivalric
yes.
Bildungsroman.
No, that's a great, no, thank you for that's yeah, no, that's a bit like Robin Hood splitting the arrow in the bullseye right there. No, no, I appreciate that contribution because right. And so that is an element that I wish to explore too. So not only the appropriate use and perhaps refining of the definition of what epic is and how it's used in relation to a video game, but then also whether in fact this is an epic and whether it is more like a chivalric romance and whether that term has also been appropriated into the video game space. And I guess if I wanted to get really excited, I might say that that'd be something I want to contribute
Mhm.
um, to the space because I think I will get wide-ranging agreement on this. I'll let you know if I'm totally wrong. That the basic model of the RPG is the chivalric romance, and that insofar as a game is sophisticated and nuanced, it diverges from that basic form. But insofar as it is traditionalist, like beloved Japanese Dragon Quest,
Right.
it is typical of it. And so perhaps, and again, I'm just now familiarizing myself with the literature, so perhaps this has already been said and said better, and that would be my expectation. But this is a young field, so one doesn't know. And so if that hasn't already been explored or beaten to the ground, as it were, hopefully that will be the third part of what I present, and hopefully that's an interesting contribution if it is a contribution at all. It's a
Well,
contribution
there's
to thinking at this point.
yeah, there's the process of uncovering, right? And it's not, as you've been saying, right? It's not the objective knowledge itself so much as the subjective encounter with it that might matter for the purposes of meaning in the sense of like human relationships, human growth, and you know, the way we choose to spend our time. Um, on the topic of the chivalric romance, I mean, there's a number of moments where you pointed out like the references that can be made to the Quixote, right?
Hey,
Um, among other epics, and there's also I think a lot of um, competition. Like there's been a lot written about competition between the Dragon Quest vein of RPGs and the Final Fantasy vein of RPGs, right? So the one that is more sort of traditional swords and sorcery, fantasy, or medieval settings, and then the one that has more of that sort of steampunk, more of that edge, which is represented really in the two art styles as well, right? You have the Akira Toriyama Dragon Ball style, manga style art, and then you have the other guy whose name escapes me, the kind of fashion designer who draw
mm,
these very sort of Art Nouveau. I don't know if that's the right term, but a very different style anyway. And a bit
More mature, more adult.
darker, grittier, more adult. Yeah. And so the kind of generational competition that took place in in the development of the two series is kind of an interesting thing to trace. And I guess you could kind of sort of map that onto like people don't really write chivalric romances anymore, but they totally write fantasy,
Yes.
steampunk type stories, ad nauseum.
Yes.
So there's that.
I like that. Steampunk and fantasy as because I mean, ultimately, and I suppose this is a bit of a claim, our amusements and literature are tied to our basic drives. This is a point that
Hmm.
I think Aristotle makes, and sometimes is ridiculed for, but maybe there's something to it analogically and in terms of correctness that it's like he said, we got to get the emotions out. Like we want to go
Hmm.
feel emotions to let it all out. And I think at the very, we play violent video games because we have aggressive impulses and it is pleasurable to let them out in a safe and way. And we read love stories because we naturally long for affection. And so even if the carriers of the amusements change, the nature of the amusements or the nature of the being that wishes to be amused is the same. And so, chivalric romances, whatever it was, whatever itch it was that those scratched, and I think we all suspected, and it gave people, some excitement in their lives, while also a sense of pleasure by experiencing art that perhaps, uh, helped them to discover something about the nature of art, nature, and even themselves. Um, that people continue to long for that same thing, but in more quote unquote advanced forms or differing forms. As technology changes, so does our way to consume art change. And so that we might read steampunk novels, or sorry, like graphic novels, because that is a far more accessible way of accessing this pleasure than being super highly literate and being able to read Ottavo Rima Italian for Orlando Furioso. Much better if there's some beautiful pictures and some limited dialogue. um, much more accessible, as it were, to people, so they can sort of scratch their Aristotelian itch, as it were, to get their sense of excitement or whatever it is. There may be, again, work that suggests that there are very sophisticated things that we get out of this work that perhaps we're going to help generate.
Yeah. Yeah. The basic drives. I mean, Aristotle talks about how people long to know, you know. Um,
Right? That's right.
Now there's
Long for the side
there's a
quest,
couple
Wes.
there's a couple minds that you should put in conversation that are more recent, although they're not very recent. Um, Northrop Frye
Of
has
course.
a lot to say about genre, and it's pretty dense and pretty interesting. And then this other author, Spariosu. So he is another
Right.
one of these kind of figures that bridges literature and games and is pretty foundational. I don't think he's as widely cited as Huizinga by a long shot, but he is a big deal for those who get deep into um, the literary side of things. And he has some work on um, ancient, Greek sort of concepts of play. And then he does a lot of just kind of surveying, the development of the concept of play across time. And again, specifically from like a literary standpoint, he's really interesting. So check out. I don't know how accessible his books are, but whatever you can find, I guess the big one is Dionysus Reborn. I think that's the title of the big
Oh,
one
wow.
on the
Do
Greeks.
you
Yeah.
know do you know his influences at all? And
Uh,
yeah, do you know anything about him in particular, like as a person? Or like,
he is a expatriate of somewhere in Eastern Europe.
Hmm.
and he cites uh, Mazzotta as one of his pals in one of his forwards. So he's in that milieu. Um, yeah, I don't know a whole lot other than that.
Oh wow.
But
Well,
I
so
think you'd
I
be.
yeah, no, well then it may be very important for you to bring him up again. I don't know how well or unwell known he is, but that's something that's nice about doing a conference and talking about things like this, and particularly in a young discipline, because it is more possible than perhaps it would be in a more established discipline that figures like that might have gone unrecognized, or the value in them and the relation to this particular discipline haven't been recognized yet. But I think I've seen one on your blog. You write about Sparioso
Yeah,
before you start your popularizing efforts of him.
right.
Um,
Yeah, so a lot of what I get in my game studies knowledge is from a podcast, naturally. Game studies, study buddies. And they ideologically are very distant from where I think you stand and I stand. And I don't agree with most of their takes on things, but they do
hmm,
know a ton of stuff, and they bring up a great many books in the field and thinkers in the field. And that's where I heard about Spariosu and Dionysus Reborn. And that title just like I was like, I have to read about this dude. Um, so that's how I heard about it. And I think that as far as Fry and the Tolkien studies wing of things, like all of that is adjacent to game studies, but I doubt there's a whole lot of people that really directly draw on that.
hmm.
Bakhtin, again, one of my intellectual heroes. I don't know that there's a lot that directly is Bakhtinian in game studies at this point, but yeah, the idea of genre clearly is very fruitful because it has a lot to do with what structures the subjective experience, right? Is like what we're expecting, what we think we're
Yes,
getting when we sit
yes,
down to play,
yes.
and how the game does or does not
How to
accommodate
appreciate it, right? That's like why kids don't like opera, because they don't yet know how to judge it appropriately.
that. But they
Uh,
like Final Fantasy VI's opera.
yeah,
The
there you
kids
go.
like that.
Some things are sweeter to the taste. Um, but yeah, no, that's really interesting. I like that you have your own take. I also have my differences with my various podcasts that I listen to, like Zyger and Resonant Arc. But again, they come from a different
Mm,
angle, more, I would
yeah.
say, game analysis and like versus other games and how they enjoy it and whether it's nostalgic for them. And they're very good reviewers of games and explainers of games. But again, I think we come from a more scholarly and also philosophical and even and but level, while also having sort of a nostalgic and personal level
Mm,
in the same way that they do. So I can't claim that that is individual to us, but I think we bring some radical elements
mhm.
to what we do, and we're about to do it not just to the public, but very much to the private, insofar as uh, not that many people go to these conferences, but it will be fun to see the people that are there. Um,
Yeah. Well, I recognize one of the names. I haven't looked up anybody yet, but the name Darshana, uh, it that one clicked with me because he has written stuff with Cameron Kunzelman of the Game Studies Study Buddies. They, I think, move in very similar circles. So the Darshana Jamain speaker, he's on one of the panels, or maybe he's one of the featured speakers. I don't know. Anyway, that's a name I have heard, and yeah, these are like some serious scholars. This is a pretty cool thing that you found. I don't know how you found this, and
yeah.
that you encouraged me to apply to. So thanks for that.
Well, I think it's going to be valuable for everybody. And they also have this very impressive game center that employs several scholars as a junior and more senior, which is amazing. But I think you were starting to make a point that I think again might be very fruitful, which is you were suggesting that these Tolkien scholars aren't maybe utilized yet by these other scholars who play games that are sort of rooted in a tradition that is connected to Tolkien. Insofar as Tolkien is the archetype for like the sort of EverQuest or Dungeons and Dragons, and then the
Yeah,
EverQuest, and then the the iterations and iterations of that. And so that besides genre considerations, like say perhaps a Lucage and also a Northrop Frye,
Mhm.
also Auerbach for that sort of thing. If
Oh
somebody
yeah.
can get the good historical thinkers, the good historical background in base, that would be very useful. But something I think at another very practical level that I think would be very interesting is we got to get your colleagues at Signum going to these conferences and presenting.
Yeah. So
I'm,
there's
yeah.
one person at least who lives in Oxford, and that's Gabriel Schenk. And he's been kind enough to talk to me about Philip Pullman quite a bit over the years. Um, I believe that he still teaches at Signum as well, and he does like videos of almost like sort of tour guide type videos, but like literary tour guide
Oh,
stuff.
cool.
He's really funny, really creative. He's interested in Welsh. He's interested in King Arthur, and he's just delightful, just a wonderful scholar and person. And so, yeah, I know that he would probably be interested. I know Serena Higgins, who has moved on since, but she's really into the occult and like the poetry of Yeats and stuff like that. And some of the more like uh, out there of the Inklings, she writes about quite a bit. So yeah, there are people within the Signum kind of a cosmos who might like to do things along these lines with the Manchester Game Center. I taught a class for them in their non-credit program about video games, and I've presented a couple times at Signum conferences and things. And so people are, you know, they're aware of it. There's some other people who've written on Final Fantasy and Zelda and its relationship to Tolkien. So there's definitely some interest in those overlaps. Um, but I don't know if uh, the uh, the audience, yeah, will include any other Signum Signumites this time around. We'll see.
Well, perhaps we can be the avant-garde, and insofar as we think they could all benefit from working with each other, you might give a better explanation than I could of Signum, but they are sort of an online university put out by a single individual who has created quite a network and with a medieval
Mhm.
flair, but that also moves into that really focuses on Tolkien and Tolkien studies, but is a little bit,
Yeah.
but is more expansive than that too.
Yeah, it's so yeah, Corey Olson taught at the um, college that I went to for undergrad, Washington College, for a long time, tenured, you know, won all the awards, just like basically did everything at that level. And he was like, you know, I just want to teach Tolkien more than I get to. Basically, he was also kind of miffed at the feeling of like the country club atmosphere of the small private liberal arts school and how it's basically out of reach for most people. And so he wanted to make that kind of education more accessible. And so his podcast really took off. He was like an early adopter of podcasting about, you know, books and stuff. It got featured on, you know, whatever Apple Podcasts was called at that time and blew up. And then he just built it up and built it up and built it up and got connected with major Tolkien scholars. They do a lot with the languages and other things that Tolkien himself studied, which is pretty unique. Like, there's not a lot of places you can learn Old English and Gothic and stuff like that. And then of course they do all these conferences now all around the world. Um, they do a lot about adaptations of Tolkien's work and adaptation studies writ large. Um, so there's that kind of thread that would lead into video games pretty naturally, I
Yes.
think.
Yes.
You know, as adaptations, as carriers of mythic material, you know, in a more popular form. There it is. So yeah, Corey Olson, he's one of my, again, you know, great living heroes, I guess you'd say, right? And kind of mentor figures, although he may not know that. He was actually my mentor when I first got to college, and he helped me sign up for classes. Okay, this is really funny. He very wisely and very gently told me that I really shouldn't take that class on it and James Joyce that I was really excited about as a freshman. He's like, you don't want to take that class. And he said he put me in his Chaucer class, and I think that was a good move. So Canterbury Tales. in my first semester at Washington College. It was still one of the great, you know, academic experiences. And yeah, I'm just very grateful for getting to meet him there, before he got big as the Tolkien professor.
Hmm. Well, that sounds very special. And perhaps everybody has a lot to learn from everybody, and hopefully our listeners, if they're interested in learning some interesting languages like Gothic, like Old English, and pursuing works like Beowulf, and the sorts of works that Tolkien loved and taught
Mhm.
and spent his life reading, and also learning about it and the adaptations, which in that recent book about Tolkien that I bought while in Spokane visiting you, um,
Mm,
mentions that it's just going to take for granted that the adaptations are part of the Tolkien universe and that that's how it's just got to be from here on out. That is, I think, a highly debatable position, and per maybe it is a maybe it is a minority position, or but it could also be a majority one. But that was certainly a position that the author of the book felt comfortable taking. And I think it is a very productive way of
yes.
understanding the world, because then the world as a constantly expanding piece of art, I think, can be, I mean, so these are the questions, right, of adaptation. It's like, does, and something I think we'll have to confront, Wes, at some point with Final Fantasy VII and its most recent adaptation. And we just have to, I think the only question is how we have to confront it, and whether we have to have Crisis Core too. And
No, no,
but
no.
yeah, no,
So
I know.
that
Yeah,
is a topic I'm gonna have to address here because yeah, my character, right, Vincent, he gets kind of pulled out and his backstory gets developed and all this. And then there's the remakes, which I have not played, and I am not able to talk about like all the interesting stuff that they're doing kind of retroactively with the story. I just I don't have time for that on this one. I'm sorry. I mean, that'll be the next book maybe.
yeah, no, 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 in the future. But insofar as we do that, we'll be able to continue to consider what the essence of a story is. And I think
Exactly.
that too is something that I see come at in two different ways. There tend to be like sort of textualist, originalist
Hmm.
readers, which those are two distinct positions, but they're similar in the respect that they're very conservative. This is
Hmm.
how it is and how it has to be. Whereas I think there's a more progressive way of reading adaptations, which is, well, they're trying to get at the truth of what was trying to be, or they're trying to create a more effective or more inclusive or a more something adaptation of the essence of this story. They're trying to get at the essence of the story in a more X way, either a more honest way, a more inclusive way, which we've seen that become very popular in recent years. And some people who have a more like fidelist idea on adaptations get upset about that, and they think, you've changed the core of things by changing this
Hmm.
property. But I think where I have a more moderate opinion in the middle on this is that, at least as a fan who has become a scholar, but is also still a fan and an amateur, as we say, right? We say we're amateurs on the channel, I guess. We love it. We don't do
And
it.
Lover, yeah.
It that's what, and this is what I think is a criticism of Final Fantasy VII's remake so far in Rebirth, um, is that the goal of the adaptation is is a superior expression of the essence of a thing, or a clearer and therefore like a more pure experience,
Hmm.
a more pure joy, a joy that even is superior to the original joy because of the quality of the production of the piece of art. And so it gets at the essence better. And I think often something that adaptations are judged harshly for is when they fail to do this.
Yes.
Uh,
There's I think a productive conversation around that and a less productive conversation. And you're definitely going down a track that I think is much more productive than others that I have heard tell of when it comes to this stuff. So yeah,
it's a
I think
polarizing issue. It's a very polarizing issue. It's either this is the story,
yeah.
or the story can develop, but it can also develop in ways that can be, I think, evaluated.
Oh,
Um,
for sure.
it's like, well, it is now being told in this way, and that improves its reach in this respect, but then it may be subject to other very substantial criticisms
Yeah.
as well. And that can also come out in how, again, we're talking about a very capitalist sort of industry here in how the players, choose with their wallets. How many of these
Oh, yeah.
games get sold over time, and those numbers can also be interpreted in different ways. But something said about, say, Final Fantasy VII Rebirth right now, and funny to be on such a tangent sort of side quest here, is that its sales numbers pale in comparison to Final Fantasy VII. But then
That's fun.
one might also keep in mind that Final Fantasy VII has had a lot longer to sell.
Yeah.
And so, yeah, it's these these things, one can come at them in many quixotic ways. It's hard to say what's a windmill and what's a giant. Um, when it,
Indeed.
but right, I think that, and that is also interesting because things like, and this is something that I have not mentioned, or I wasn't planning to mention in my paper, but maybe I will include an element of is fandoms.
Oh, yeah. The whole fandom studies and reception studies um, is also an angle that people get really, really into and really invested in. Um, and I think you could do that in a kind of psychological way, which I think is
Hmm,
more interesting personally than the kind of sociological approach that often,
sure.
and maybe that's too like broad a brush to paint the bifurcation there with, um, but yeah, I mean, I think it's really interesting to look at why particular people get interested in particular things versus saying this kind of person, right, tends to be interested in this kind of thing. Um, yeah, I don't know.
Yes,
That's
no,
maybe
that
a
it,
whole
it
other
is
topic.
interesting how the case study actually has broader value because it gives a particular perspective that can then be useful to a more general audience. It doesn't just give a general idea that is supposed to be representative of a bunch of people that doesn't have its substance in direct perception of an actual reality, right? That's the problem with generalizations. They're they're very okay representations of what something is. They're not.
And it might be very useful when you're a large company corporation trying to sell a lot of something, right? And so there's obviously a place for that sort of statistic as well.
Thus the value of Dragon Quest, right? No, I'm just kidding. Huh? Hired as the kids would have said 10 years ago. Um, but all in good fun, as it were. That's the great magic wand, right? All in good fun. Or as Dr. Mike Israetel, a much bigger podcaster than we at this point, says, all jokes here, all jokes. But that said, joking and gestures and side quests, all side quests must come to an end. All gestures must stop juggling, and all Rin fairs, which I think is what another thing people think of when they think of medievalists, though
Yeah.
apparently they should be thinking of video games now, must come to an end. Unless
Yeah,
time
man,
gets.
it's like practically midnight there. You gotta go to bed. Come on.
Oh, yeah, that's true. It's getting kind of late, but anything for our viewers, as you know, I wanted to share the Oxford experience with them. And also, it's good to catch up with you and get rooted, even though you are
Yeah.
so far away in time and in space now. But again, closer than ever because of the power of the T1 connection.
I mean, yeah, I'll see you hopefully at least once more before the conference, but I'm really looking forward to that. And yeah, thanks for making the time to talk through some of these ideas. I think it'll be helpful when we sit down to write.
Absolutely. I can't wait. And I hope the listeners saw some great value in this. I drop a link to Signum U and maybe to the conference in the description. And if I don't, please remind me. And I look forward to talking to you, like you said, one more time before the conference and then there and then sitting down and putting a bunch of this stuff into print.
Sounds good. Thanks again.